They used to call that stretch of highway the spine of Clay County, a crooked, bone-white road cutting through fields that never truly died, only dried and slept beneath the heat. If you drive far enough past the timberline, beyond the last gas pump and the last sound of dogs barking, you'll find what's left of it, a weathered shape leaning against the horizon like an exhausted thought. That's where the hollow house stands. I first heard about it in the summer of 1948, when Mississippi felt older than the rest of the world, as if the years moved slower there, weighed down by heat and dust. It was the kind of place where cicadas screamed themselves hoarse by noon, and silence came heavy after sundown, hanging over the land like a thick sheet. They said that silence could drive a man to hear things that weren't there. Whispers in the corn rows, a name called from across the field when no one was working that day. Back then, most of the county was farmland and failed businesses. The post-war boom hadn't reached this far south. The railroad that once fed the town of Merrow had been abandoned since '43, and the depot rotted like an empty rib cage. The air smelled of rust and river mud, and sometimes, when the wind blew from the west, you could catch the faint odor of something burnt. Old timber, maybe, or the ghosts of crop fires that once scoured these plains clean. The hollow house wasn't a name given by architects or families. It was what the locals called it after the Whitakers disappeared. The original deed called it the Whitaker Homestead, a two-story plantation-style farmhouse built sometime around 1909. When you saw it from the road, the front porch seemed to sag forward, the windows hollowed out like sockets, and the roofline bent in the middle as if the house itself had been breathing for too long. I came to Merrow that July, traveling on assignment for a small southern magazine that specialized in documenting vanishing towns of America. At least, that's what I told myself. Truth was, I had nowhere else to go. The war had taken too many years, and what came back wasn't the same man who left. I had grown accustomed to the sound of absence, long corridors, distant echo, the whine of machines that stopped too suddenly. Perhaps that's why the hollow house called to me, before I even knew what it was. The people of Merrow didn't speak about it directly. When you asked, they'd either look away or start talking about the weather. Some said it wasn't a house at all anymore, that something hollow had moved in after the Whitakers were gone. The sheriff, an old man named Duggan, told me he'd been called out there once, years before, after neighbors claimed they'd seen a light moving through the upstairs window in the dead of night. Probably kids, he said, though his eyes didn't agree with his mouth. That first evening, I checked into the only boarding house still open, a two-story structure beside the general store. The landlady, Mrs. Brom, kept a small desk fan running in the hall, though it only pushed the hot air around. When I mentioned the Whitaker property, her hand froze halfway to her apron pocket. She didn't tell me not to go. No one ever said that outright. They just spoke slower, softer, as if saying too much might wake something still sleeping out there. The next morning, I walked down the county road before sunrise. The fog lay low over the fields, and the world smelled of wet earth and the sharp scent of kudzu. I could see the remnants of fence posts rising from the weeds, the way bones rise from soil after a heavy rain. The hollow house waited somewhere beyond a line of dying oaks, where the ground began to slope toward the river. There's a strange thing that happens when you walk through land like that. The silence folds around you. Your footsteps stop sounding like your own. The birds don't move until you've already passed them. I remember feeling that the air itself was older there, thicker, less forgiving. I found the house by accident. One moment, it was just the trees and the humming of insects. The next, it was standing before me, pale and broad, its frame twisted by time. The porch boards bowed inward like a mouth ready to whisper. The windows were bare, and the curtains inside, if they could still be called that, clung to the glass in shredded ribbons. The house faced east, toward the rising sun, but the light didn't seem to touch it. Instead, the shadows stretched long and cold across the front steps. The air smelt faintly of cedar and something else, a sweet metallic odor I couldn't name. There were no birds on the roof, no sound of animals in the field, just the faint, endless hum of the wind pushing through the hollow boards. I remember thinking it didn't feel abandoned. Not exactly. It felt paused, like a breath held for too many years. The front door was warped, but standing. A faded horseshoe hung above the frame, its nails rusted to the color of dried blood. The knob turned easily, though I hadn't expected it to. When I pushed the door open, the hinges let out a sigh that seemed almost human. Inside, the air was cool and stale. The wallpaper peeled in long curls, showing bare wood beneath. Dust floated in the sunlight, thick and slow, moving like underwater silt. A staircase rose from the foyer, narrow and crooked, its railing missing in places. To the right was what used to be a parlor. A piano sat against the far wall. Its keys warped, one leg snapped and repaired with wire. And yet, the strangest thing was the smell. Not of rot or mildew, but something faintly floral. It reminded me of lilacs. There shouldn't have been lilacs here, not in this heat, not after all these years. I walked deeper. The floorboards moaned in protest, though each sound felt deliberate, as if the house wanted me to know where I was. A framed photograph hung crooked in the hallway, a family of 4, posed stiffly on that same porch. The edges of the image were faded, and a thin film of mold had eaten away most of their faces. But the father's eyes, pale, almost colorless, remained intact. It was then that I heard it. A faint sound, somewhere above. Not movement exactly, but pressure. The slow, deliberate shift of weight across an old floor. I froze. The sound came again, then stopped. The wind could have caused it. Old houses make their own music when the air moves through them. That's what I told myself. But the air had gone still. And then I realized something that would stay with me for the rest of that summer. There was no echo in that house. Every sound, my breath, my steps, the creak of the floorboards, died instantly, as though the walls swallowed them whole. It was as if the space itself refused to give anything back. That's why they called it the Hollow House. When I finally stepped out again, the light had shifted. The morning fog was gone, but the air felt thicker, heavier. The fields beyond shimmered under the sun, yet the house cast a shadow longer than it should have. I took one last look at the windows and thought for a second I saw something behind the glass, a shape, still and patient. But the next blink showed only emptiness. I started back toward the road. The sound of the cicadas returned, loud and endless, and I remember feeling grateful for the noise. Later that evening, as I wrote my notes, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird since I'd left town that morning, not one. And though I told myself I'd go back the next day, something in me already knew I wouldn't sleep that night.
The Hollow House had been empty for nearly 10 years when I first stepped across its threshold. 10 years since the Whitakers vanished, leaving behind everything but themselves. Their story had long since turned to rumor, the kind that changed shape depending on who was telling it, and in Merrow, stories were a kind of local currency. It took me 2 days to piece together the bones of what had happened, and even then they didn't fit quite right. According to the county archive, the property was purchased in 1909 by a man named Elias Whitaker, who'd made his money in lumber up near the Tennessee line. He came south with his wife, Martha, and 2 young daughters, Clara and June, and built that house with his own crew of carpenters, mostly freedmen who knew the land better than he ever would. The newspapers from that year described the homestead as a fine example of Southern perseverance and family virtue, the kind of sentence men wrote when they didn't know what else to say. For a time, it must have been beautiful. The land was fertile, the cotton thick and high. The Whitakers were said to host gatherings in the early years, Sunday picnics, dances, readings under the oaks. The piano in the parlor had come all the way from New Orleans, and the girls were taught by a traveling instructor who stayed each spring. Then, sometime around 1924, the reports stopped. No one knew exactly when things began to go wrong. The county ledger shows that the last taxes were paid in '32, but people in town said the family had started keeping to themselves long before that. Elias stopped coming to Merrow for supplies. The postman claimed letters began piling up, unopened, by the gate. The daughters stopped attending Sunday service, and by the time the Depression hit, it was said that the only time you saw movement near the house was at night, a lantern swaying through the fields, though no horses were kept there anymore. I found a photograph in the Merrow Gazette archives, taken in 1918, the last known image of the Whitakers. They stood in front of the porch, the 2 girls barefoot in white dresses, Martha holding a parasol, and Elias standing slightly apart, his hand resting on the railing. There was something odd about the picture, not what was there, but what wasn't. The shadows. None of them seemed to fall quite right. When I asked Sheriff Duggan about it, he frowned. "You won't find much truth in paper around here," he said. "That house got a way of changing what people remember." He wasn't wrong. The deeper I looked, the more the facts bent around it, like the heat haze on the road that makes distance flicker and fold. One man told me Elias went mad after his youngest died of fever. Another swore the whole family drowned in the river, and that what people saw after were not the Whitakers at all. There was talk of seances, of strange lights, of something buried beneath the cellar that shouldn't have been. That night, I couldn't shake the image of that house breathing, not literally, but in the slow, invisible rhythm of settling timber and shifting wind. Around midnight, I heard tapping. 3 soft knocks, like fingers against glass. They came from the wall behind my bed. The boarding house was old, its boards thin, and I told myself it was just the wind or rats, but the pattern came again, steady, deliberate, tap, tap, tap. When I stood and pressed my ear to the wood, the sound stopped. The silence afterward was so complete it seemed alive. I left the lamp burning until dawn. The next morning, I returned to the Hollow House. I told myself it was for the article, but truthfully, I felt drawn, as though something there had taken notice of me, and turning away would have been rude. The fields were quieter than before. The wind had died, and the air hung heavy with the smell of rain that never came. I followed the same path between the oaks, noticing now that the grass grew in uneven patches, as though certain parts of the ground refused to feed anything at all. Inside, the light had changed. The dust that once shimmered in the air now looked dull, motionless. The piano was gone from the parlor. I was sure of it. Where it had stood, there was only a deep scar in the floorboards and a faint, almost circular stain, darker than the rest of the wood. The wallpaper near the stairs had peeled further, revealing faint markings beneath, symbols scratched into the wall itself. They weren't letters, at least not any I recognized. Circles within circles, small vertical lines, and something that looked like an open eye. I felt the temperature drop as I traced one with my fingertip. The wood beneath was unnaturally cold. A floorboard creaked upstairs. I called out, foolishly, expecting no reply, and got one. It came as a whisper, low and distant, not from above, but behind the wall itself. Leave it. The sound was faint but clear, a woman's voice, breathy, as if carried on the edge of wind. I stepped back fast enough to knock over a small table near the door. The crash echoed through the house, and then, just as suddenly, the silence swallowed it whole. When I fled outside, the air felt hot again, alive, as though the world had been holding its breath until I crossed the threshold. That night, I returned to town and went straight to the records office. The clerk, a young woman named Evelyn, had worked there since the war. When I mentioned the Whitakers, she hesitated, then pulled out a thin folder, one she said she wasn't supposed to show. Inside were 5 documents, 2 property deeds, a death certificate for a June Whitaker, dated 1924, a sheriff's notice about missing persons, dated March 1938, and a handwritten letter never mailed. The letter was addressed to Sheriff Duggan. The handwriting was trembling, almost illegible, but one line stood out. They said the house is empty, but it listens. It remembers the ones it takes. The signature was smudged, but I could make out the initials, M.W., Martha Whitaker. Evelyn told me that when the sheriff went to investigate, the house was locked from the inside. No sign of struggle, no tracks, no furniture moved, just emptiness, and a smell of lilacs that lingered for weeks. I didn't tell her I'd smelled the same thing. Later that evening, I sat outside the boarding house, watching the sky turn to bruised purple. The crickets were loud again, too loud, their rhythm mismatched, like 100 clocks wound to the wrong time. I noticed then the strange quiet from across the road. Every window of the general store was dark. The lights inside had gone out, one by one, though I could swear I saw a faint glow moving between the aisles, as if someone carried a lantern. I stood, but when I blinked, it was gone. Behind me, the wind picked up, and for a moment I could swear I smelled lilacs again. The next morning, I decided to go back one last time. Not to write, not to photograph, but to listen. There was something in that house that wanted to be heard.
It was a Sunday when I made my last trip to the Whitaker place. The town of Merrow was silent that morning. No church bells, no voices in the diner, not even the distant hum of a car along the county road. The sky was the color of iron. I left before dawn, camera slung over my shoulder, flashlight, and a copy of Martha's letter folded inside my jacket. I told myself it was research, that I was chasing a story, but by then I knew better. I wasn't chasing anything. The house was pulling me. The closer I got, the quieter the world became. Even the cicadas stopped singing when I reached the edge of the property. The air hung heavy with the smell of rain and lilacs, always lilacs. The front door was open this time. It hadn't been before. Inside, everything looked arranged. The piano was back. It stood exactly where I'd first seen it, though one of the keys was chipped and another hung loose, clicking when the wind moved through the room. The photographs on the wall had shifted too. Where once they showed faces turned toward the camera, now every figure looked away, their bodies angled toward something beyond the frame. On the dining table lay a set of porcelain plates, clean, dustless, as though waiting for supper, 4 of them. I should have left then, but I didn't. The house was breathing again. I could feel it in the soles of my shoes, a faint vibration, steady and slow, like the pulse of something alive buried deep beneath the floorboards. When I stepped into the parlor, the sound of the wind outside disappeared. There was only a low hum, almost too low to hear, rising and falling, like a hymn sung behind closed doors. I followed it. It led me to the cellar. The door to the cellar was different than I remembered. A heavy wooden slab with new nails driven in from the outside. Someone had sealed it once, long ago, and something had forced it open again. The hinges were bent, and a faint trail of soil led down the steps into the dark. I turned on my flashlight. The air was cold, damp, and close. The cellar walls were covered in the same markings I'd seen beneath the wallpaper. Circles within circles, eyes without pupils, and something that looked almost like a map drawn by someone who'd never seen the world above. At the far end, half buried in dirt, I saw wood. Not a coffin, but a chest, wide, flat, with a rusted lock long since broken. When I knelt beside it, the smell hit me first. Not rot, not death, but perfume, lilac and old wood. Inside, there were children's toys. A doll with one glass eye, a small brass bell, a folded dress that might once have been white, and beneath them a thin stack of photographs, all the same. 4 figures standing on the porch of the Whittaker house, taken from the same angle, but each slightly different. In one, the father was missing, in the next, the mother, then one of the daughters, and in the final photo, only the house remained. The light flickered. Something moved behind me. A breath, close enough to shift the dust. Then the sound of a piano key, just one, struck gently in the darkness above. I climbed the steps slowly, the boards groaning beneath me. When I reached the parlor again, the air had changed. The room felt smaller, not physically, but as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. The piano was open. Every key was pressed down, as though invisible hands held them in place. And behind the instrument, where the wallpaper had peeled, the cymbals began to glow faintly, pale white like frost catching moonlight. They pulsed in rhythm with the hum. I realized then what it was. Not a song, not a haunting. It was memory. The house was remembering itself. There are moments when time folds, when the past doesn't return so much as it refuses to leave. As I stood there, the air thickened, the light shifted, the parlor wasn't empty anymore. A woman stood by the piano, her back to me. Her dress was old, torn at the hem, her hair pinned in the way women wore it 30 years ago. Next to her stood 2 children, their faces indistinct, as though made of smoke that refuses to hold shape. The woman turned her head slightly, enough that I could see the outline of her profile. "Martha," I whispered. She didn't move. Her hand rose slowly to the piano, resting on the same chipped key. And then she spoke. Or rather, her voice filled the room, though her lips didn't move. We asked it for time. It gave us silence. Her words echoed, soft at first, then deeper, until they seemed to come from beneath the floor itself. It remembers. It keeps what we give. The 2 children turned then, both looking at me, with faces blurred, but eyes unmistakably human, wide, dark, and endless. One of them reached out a hand. For a heartbeat, I saw the shape of the house reflected in her eyes, but not as it was, as it had been, bright, alive, filled with laughter and the scent of supper on the stove. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. The light snapped back. The figures vanished. The hum stopped. Only the faint ticking of something unseen remained. I stumbled out into the daylight, gasping like a man dragged from underwater. The fields were quiet again, too quiet, and for the first time I noticed something I hadn't before. There were no birds. Not a single sound came from the trees. Just the wind, moving through the grass in long, slow breaths. When I looked back at the house, the front door was closed. And in the upstairs window, for just a second,
I thought I saw someone watching, a silhouette, still, waiting. I left Merrow the next morning, never wrote the article, never told anyone what I'd seen. But sometimes, when the air turns thick with summer heat, I swear I can smell lilacs again, faint, almost sweet, carried on a wind that seems to whisper names I don't know. And when I dream, I see the house, still standing there in the fields, unchanged, unmoving, as though time itself has forgotten it. A place that remembers everything. A place that never lets go.
Thank you for listening. New day, new story. Come back tomorrow. We'll keep the light on just long enough for you to find the next one.